Okay, I want to thank Steve and Cosme and other members of UPWA and whomever is responsible for this conference today. Thank you for inviting me. What do I do, a short one or a long one? 20 minutes or 2 hours? Okay, you know, it all depends. I'll do a short one. One of the dilemmas today is that there's a football team named the 49ers who are playing this afternoon. So I have a self-imposed, at 3:30, I have a self-imposed limit as to how long I can stay here. What I'd like to do is to try to give some kind of conceptual and theoretical background to this privatization and corporatization of public education, not only in California, but obviously in the United States, as well as a global project too. There's four areas I'd like to mention. First, I'd like to give a short biographical sketch just to give you some idea of where I'm coming from related to my own personal experiences. And then what I'd like to delve into is some kind of analysis. The first area I'd like to talk about is what are the patterns or what are the tendencies that we see related to privatization / corporatization of education. There's no doubt in my mind everybody in this room is extremely familiar with all of those things, so I just want to sketch them out just so we can have it on the table. Then what I'd like to do is to go into the meat of my comments to give some kind of theoretical analysis as to why this is going on. Obviously, various positions in our political culture might blame it on the Republicans or blame it on Bush or blame it on Obama or blame it on Schwarzenegger, et cetera. We'd like to take the analysis a little bit deeper than that to show why this is happening on a structural level. And then the third area I'd like to comment on is the big question, and that is what must be done. Obviously, I don't have any total answers there, but I do have a few views, a few points that I think are important related to trying to understand what is happening, where we are at, and where we're going. Related to the biographical sketch, we'll do this quickly. I like to consider myself a child of the California Master Plan for Higher Education. Right on. I graduated from high school in 1962, went to public high school in South Central Los Angeles, George Washington High School. It was an excellent high school, and I'm very proud of my experiences there. Then I went to LA Harbor Community College and got an AA degree in 1964 and transferred to Chico State and got an AA degree, excuse me, a BA degree and later an MA and a general secondary credential. Most of us know what the California Master Plan for Higher Education was, but because of the fact that this is being recorded, I'd just like to give a brief description of it. Back in 1960, the state legislature and the sitting governor at the time, Edmund G. Pat Brown, the father of the current governor, came up with the plan. And the basic principles behind the plan was one, a free education for everyone in the state of California, free college education, as well as open access. And you can guess in my final comments, I'm going to call for a free college education and open access. And in fact, the comments I'm going to make is why has California moved so radically or extremely from the basic principles of that system. Just to add a few more things about my experience as a student, I think the tuition I paid at LA Harbor College in 1962 was $7.50 for 15 units. And then when I went to Chico, it was $47.50 for 15 units. And in fact, it wasn't even called tuition at the time. It was fees for student activities and things like that. Tuition became formalized a little bit later. The other point I want to make biographically is the importance of that system for someone like me. I like to consider myself a working class Negro. Okay, in the sense, those were my roots. My father was a carpenter. I was the first person in my family to have access to college education. I was the first one in my family to finish college. And that was largely because of that system. What that allowed me to do is to become a teacher. And from 1970, after teaching high school for 3 years, I taught political science at California State University, Chico, up until 2003, to be candid. And since, after retiring there, I've been teaching history at Skyline Community College. So I've seen the literal insides, or the belly, if you will, of these institutions that have been assaulted over the last 35 or 40 years. And much of what I do today is motivated by my anger and frustration for the anger and frustration at the conditions that my students have to face today, in contrast to the kind of experiences that I had some 40 or almost 50 years ago. Now, what has happened over the last 35 or 40 years to public education in general and higher education specifically? It seems to me that there's a couple ways to examine this. I'd like to go into it conceptually first. I think we cannot be romantic about public education, and unfortunately I feel a lot of us are, or a lot of people are. We have to be pretty realistic about what public education was from the very beginning, going back to the 1880s. Public education was always integral or central to the political economy, meaning it was promoted and oriented to benefit the system as a whole. Those two or three areas, I think, that the system wanted public education to achieve was a socialization process related to teaching East European and Southern European immigrants English to promote patriotism, loyalty to the country, etc. Secondly, it was always a training or channeling institution as well, meaning to channel young people into particular sectors of the economy. It was there at the very, very beginning. Since World War II, I think we can add a third component to the function of public education, and that was that its role was to be a reserve labor pool. There's a lot of literature on that theme in and of itself, but obviously when you have an economy and you have an increasing number of graduates from high school and there's no real niche for them in the economy, you need a place for them to sit until they can be trained or socialized to get into the economy. So again, my point is that we cannot romanticize the role of public education within a capitalist political economy. Nevertheless, what I believe in very, very strongly, in spite of that reality, public education is vital for people, for individuals, and for the society as a whole. It seems to me, making a list of some of the things that I think are valuable, by the way, these are things that I've benefited from, and hopefully the things that I've been able to impart on students that I've had over the last 45 years of teaching. First is social mobility. That goes without speaking. Second is personal development, skills, confidence, knowledge, talent, inspiration, and confidence. All of these things come out of public education. Thirdly, critical thinking. Now, obviously, that's a problematic within the curriculum, but I always believe that individual teachers, particularly in the humanities and the social sciences, have played a role in promoting critical thinking. And out of that, one even coming from this deeply laden socialization process that we're subject to, can become independent thinkers, people that look at the world in systemic ways. I know that is what happened to me when I went to college. And then I think the fourth, and perhaps maybe the most important, is that the university, the college campus, JC, state, whatever, has been and can be a space or a platform for social movements. And certainly most of us in this room had some contact with the 60s and other movements since the 60s, and we understand that importance. And we're also seeing this campus being a genesis for this next round of protest as well. Within that context, what are the patterns that I see, and I'm positive all of us in this room see as well? Let's go over them fairly quickly because we could go into great detail related to each point. Budget cuts, and the implication of budget cuts are layoffs, increased student-teacher ratios in the classroom, reduction of curriculum offering, particularly in the arts, the humanities, and physical education, areas that are vital for young people's well-being, I think. We see recently the difficulty of students being able to enroll in classes, having to spend 3 or 4 or a couple extra years at college because of that. Also, we see the proliferation of part-time teachers on the community college, state college, and university level, and all of us understand the difficulties and problems that part-time teachers face. The second pattern is the increased cost of education for young people and returning students. I have a list here of what tuition cost at UC back in '56 all the way to the present. Back in '56 it was $42, '62 it was $75, '70 it was $235, and now what is it, about almost $13,000 a year for tuition. Now, I don't know exactly how much inflation we've had in the last 40, 50 years. It's probably around 500%. So my students over at Skyline who have to pay $46 a unit next semester, is it 36 this semester? Thank you. Should only be paying $35 for all 15 units. The third area of tendencies has to do with the shift or the changing in curriculum. Obviously, this major shift towards basic skills, the reduction of the humanities and the social sciences and physical education, and the reorientation of the channeling process. And in fact, that's a major theme related to the policies of Bush and Obama, as well as other policies that we'll mention very briefly in a moment. Obviously, the increased proliferation of testing, the pernicious activity of testing, as well as so-called assessments. The general theme I see is the dumbing down of my students rather than them becoming more brighter. The fourth pattern has to do with privatization / corporatization. There's a long list: charter schools, the testing assessment industry, the corporate managerialism that's taken over on the college campuses, increased tuition, research priorities, the privatization of services, also the corporatization of college sports, for example, which is a story in and of itself that is just mind-boggling. And many people in this room may not like sports or follow sports, but even with in the so-called Pac-12 now, with this new contract they've signed with these major networks, even the traditional Saturday afternoon football game is no longer on the agenda. Games are being played whenever TV wants them to be played, and they're generally not, the time is generally not announced until the week before the game, okay? So you can have, as one of my buddies, the Jet, said to me the other day, the Cal-Stanford game is going to be in October next year. I mean, that's actually ridiculous. That's dictated by television, okay? And then obviously the proliferation of these private colleges, the University of Phoenix, et cetera, which is just robbing young people, and the corporatization of the issue of student loans. That is also a very horrific theme. The fifth area, I see a major shift in education from where, under the California Master Plan for Higher Education, education was a right. I asked some of my students at Skyline the other day what a right was, and they had problems, but we went back to the Constitution about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Education has been shifted from being a right to being a privilege. I saw this begin in the 1970s at Chico State. I would argue since the 2008 financial crisis, education has become a privilege if you can get in. So it's even worse than it was 3 or 4 years ago. The next area has to do with the assault on public teacher unions. I think everybody in this room is involved in that, has a case study, has personal experiences to talk about. I'm just, appalled by this. The demonization of teachers and putting the entire onus of student performance on teachers is just reprehensible to me. Steve referred to this booklet that I wrote recently. You can get access to it up on the table on the top, where we critique Greenhut's book entitled Plunder, where he argues that public worker unions, public teacher unions are the cause of the economic crisis. And in that book, they go after teachers very, very viciously, as well as other public sector workers. And I guess the final pattern that I see is not just the erosion of the California Master Plan for Higher Education, but the actual elimination of that plan. I don't think it exists anymore in the mission and spirit that it was initially intended to be. The structures may exist to some degree, but the spirit and intent does not exist anymore. In light of that, there's a couple other points that I want to make along that line, and I'm not going to go into any detail here, but I want to refer to 2 articles that I've read within the last few months that I think would be very, very handy to look at to get a couple case studies as to what is going on related to privatization of education. One is an article that I found on Huffington Post Business, written by Bob Samuels, who wrote this last year. At the time, I assume he still is, he was AFT president for the UC system, and it's entitled How America's Universities Became Hedge Funds. And he goes into an analysis of the UC system and how it has shifted to where it is just fundamentally a business, and it uses tuition and increased tuition to fund that business. And without going into all of his points, I'll just read one quick quote from the end of his piece. Quote, in fact, while most schools insist that students are not paying the full cost of their education, UCB professor Charles Schwartz has shown that virtually every university inflates the advertised cost of education so that they can constantly raise tuition and use the added income to support profit-making ventures and risky financial investments. That more or less synthesizes Samuel's point. The other document is actually not an article, but this was something that's just come out in the last couple of weeks. We on the junior college level have been aware of it, and I hear hisses and booing and obscene gestures throughout the arena, and so there must be an awareness of this document. This is called the California Community College Student Success Task Force. You can go to the JC or California Community College Chancellor's website and get a copy of this. This is obviously very, very sinister, but fits obviously very neatly into the 40-year project of privatization. Pardon? Yeah. Oh, the title is California Community College's Student Success Task Force. And the basic objective in this project is to create a coordinated curriculum through the K through 12 system, all the way through the UC system. And the community colleges is to be a part of that nexus to channel students to prepare them, as the document says, for college and career readiness. Okay, meaning that liberal arts, critical thinking, etc., is out the door. The document reads, to encourage more students to achieve those standards by clearly defining college and career expectations. The document is about 75 pages, but I think what I've just said to you distills the meaning. What is also more important, I think, is who funded this task force. Well, on page 72 of the document, we see that the following foundations funded this task force: the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the James Irvine Foundation, the Walter S. Johnson Foundation, the Lumia Foundation, and the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. I've gone to the websites of all of these foundations, and I assure you that their concerns are aimed at restructuring the JC system to just simply train students for the third worldization of the job market. Just like the Gates Foundation is the major funder behind this charter school movement. Let's wait, please. Now, let's get into why this is happening. This is what I'm most interested in and what I've been studying for the last 40 or 50 years. I've got some ideas written down here. This privatization process that has been going on for since the early 70s, and in fact, I remember in 1967, a year after Reagan, actually he had just been inaugurated back in 67, a group of graduate students at Chico came down to Sacramento. I think this was in mid-January of 67. And we had a march with other state college students where Reagan had just proposed raising tuition for graduate students at the state college level. And we actually had a confrontation with Reagan that day as well. There were a lot of boos in the audience, or in the group, but we won't go into that right now. What I'm saying is I've seen this start since about 1967, and it's obviously just accelerated. But I would argue that this privatization is part of a combination of a 40-year process or dynamic of restructuring the United States / global political economy, as well as constructing, institutionalizing, and implementing a hegemonic ideology called neoliberalism, okay? So the drive for this privatization is rooted in the restructuring of the global / national political economy, and that the ideology to rationalize, justify, and to provide policy guidelines for that process within the political arena is shaped by neoliberalism. So what I need to do now is to define specifically what I mean by the economic restructuring and what I mean by a hegemonic ideology and neoliberalism specifically. How I look at the political economy related to restructuring is related to what I call, or what others have called, an accumulation model. Meaning, what is the model that allows dominant economic interests or capital to profit at any point in time? After the war, after World War II, up until the early 70s, the accumulation model centered around two dominant industries or sectors. One was the automobile industrial sector or complex as the propelling industry and the driving force of the economy. That's how profit was made, was around that propelling industry, the automobile industrial complex, as well as military spending. We have to also remember that the banks were highly regulated. This is something that Roosevelt did almost immediately upon coming into the White House by passing the so-called Glass-Steagall Act back in 1933. So speculation in finance was not a major source of profit for capital or capitalist up until about 1970. The ideology or dominant ideology that shaped that accumulation model was something that can be called corporate liberalism. We're generally more comfortable with terms like the Great Society or the New Frontier or the New Deal. But I would argue those are just labels to define policy that is part of a much broader dominant ideology or hegemonic ideology. Corporate liberalism was the dominant ideology up until about 70. Now, what a dominant ideology does is it establishes the parameters for acceptable political agendas. It establishes the parameters for acceptable political debate. It defines the parameters for the acceptable policy formulation process. It establishes the acceptable parameters for policy legislation and for the implementation of policy, okay? Now, corporate liberalism was based on an idea that the role of government was to intervene into the economy, to manage and regulate the economy, to establish a stable political economy for corporations to prosper. We see Teddy Roosevelt implementing initially corporate liberalism. Without going into a lot of details, what that also meant is government was supposed to provide a safety net. It was supposed to promote public education. It was supposed to provide welfare and social programs for people who faced disenfranchisement or impoverishment or social crisis, okay? Most of us in this room are children of corporate liberalism, I believe very strongly. But starting in the 60s into the 70s, that accumulation model began to face crisis. The two general areas of crisis was one, a falling rate of profit from, let's say, 63, 64 to about 68. And the other was the beginnings of inflation, leading to, in the early 70s, so-called stagflation. So the dominant economic interests had to figure out what could they do to restore rates of profit. And so basically, the first thing they did was to begin deindustrializing the American political economy, to move production out of the northeast sector of the society and the West Coast, to move them to third world countries where labor costs were dirt cheap. I think all of us are familiar with all of this. And what we begin to see from that point on is the restructuring of an accumulation model to generate profit. What we see is deindustrialization, an increased emphasis on military spending, and certainly Carter, I did my PhD thesis on Carter. He begins to increase military spending, and Reagan obviously does that like with steroids. We also see a shift towards high tech, a shift towards a service-based economy, and we see speculation increasingly becoming a center, a means to develop profit. Now, at the same time, and David Harvey in his book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, Tom Ferguson and Joel Rogers in their book, The Right Turn, published back in 1986, and many others have more or less explained how corporate liberalism was dismantled and this new ideology of neoliberalism was put into place. And by the middle, and certainly by Reagan, neoliberalism was now institutionalized. Well, what are the guidelines of neoliberalism? The guidelines of neoliberalism are, one, the rich don't pay taxes. You cut taxes for the wealthy. Second, you deregulate the economy. And obviously, if you just look at the deregulation of the banking industry, we can see that process, something that Carter started as early as 1980. We've probably all seen Charles Ferguson's film Inside Job. How many have seen that? That gives a pretty decent picture of that process, although it still doesn't give the complete picture. So we see deregulation, whatever sector of the economy you want to deal with. We see cutting social spending, and we see the privatization of the public sector. And the fifth part of the agenda is to bust unions. And I would argue that since the early 70s, that has been the framework of public policy. And it has been implemented in a persistent manner, although each particular institution or sector of the economy has been addressed at different rates of speed, if you will, and different levels of emphasis during that reality. Obviously, welfare was a major target initially, et cetera, et cetera. So what we see is that the attack on public education is not something that we could just call a bipartisan project between the Republicans and the Democrats or something that Bush promoted. It is actually rooted in the drive of capital or dominant economic interests to profit. Now, what we see is a certain timeline or a certain set of contours related to the attack on public education and, for that matter, public sector unions. And to speed this up a little bit and just to kind of focus on, I think, what is the most important point, is that the financial crisis of 2008 created a political opening, I think, that allowed an intensification on the public sector, an intensification of the assault on public education. So if we kind of feel that since 2008, the assault has intensified on unions, public sector unions, and on public education as a whole, you're not wrong. But I would also want us to realize that this assault is rooted in the fact that capital felt very strongly there was no opposition, political opposition to do that, to resist that, and they could take full advantage of it. Therefore, in making some conclusions here, is that the ongoing and intensified assault on the public sector in general and public education specifically is part of a new accumulation model that intends to raid the public sector of every ounce of surplus that exists in that sector, as well for profit as well as for paying for the crisis that they created. So what we see related to education is the deepening of the commodification of education. We see efforts to break any level of resistance in the classroom and in the student unions and in the free speech areas to this assault. And we also see the assault on public worker unions, which is perceived to be a potential resistance to this project. What we also want to say is this is not just a California project or a national project. This is happening all over the world. To wrap this up, what must be done? We've got maybe 3 or 4 points very quickly, hopefully. I think the first thing that stands out in my mind as various social movements begin to reemerge, obviously the Occupy movement is probably a centerpiece of that at this point in time, that we have to be very careful related to the agendas and programs and ideas that we want to promote. We cannot find ourselves trapped within the neoliberal project. We have to develop counter-hegemonic agendas and programs and ideologies. I'll give you an example of what I perceive to be a neoliberal trap. I read in the Chronicle on Thursday that a group of students based at UC Riverside had come up with a solution to deal with the tuition problem. And that solution was to defray tuition while they're attending school, and then they were going to pay 5% of their salaries for the next 20 years to pay back those tuition costs. And UC Chancellor in the article, Mark Yudof, said that he would consider that, okay? I think all of us in the room see what I'm talking about, okay? This is not an alternative by any stretch of the imagination. This is a neoliberal solution to the problem, okay? And so what I propose that we need to go back to where college was free and that students don't have to pay tuition at all. The other points, and this is where we become political here, and that is that we also must recognize that the Democratic Party, that great, great party that many of us love, quote unquote, I'm putting quotes around that, and also much of the trade union bureaucracy is also linked, not only locked, but are agents of the neoliberal program. They, in fact, are the handmaidens of the corporate financial system. And they are not a vehicle for change from my position. And we have to be very, very careful about the co-optation process that is underway related to trying to co-opt the Occupy movement and other forces. And then the final point is obviously we need to break out of our little fragmented units and develop solidarity and large-scale coalitions to fight this process. And we also have to be international in scope as well. Thank you very much.